Hi guys, welcome to the first video in my series on how to write a history paper. This is intended as a supplementary thing, kind of to go along with whatever you're being told in class. I'm intentionally making this for my students that I am either the TA for, the teaching assistant for, or who I'm actively instructing. With most things online these days, it made sense to have kind of an online tutorial session. This is not meant to replace what you're being taught in class, but to go along with it. What we're going to do today is we are going to talk about the first step in writing a history paper. And we're starting with the second you pick up that prompt, and we're going to take you to the point where you're kind of ready to start writing the paper. So we're going to handle that first step. Other videos will handle the rest of the writing process. We're going to start at the beginning with this video. This is a great resource if you're having a hard time getting started. Let me share the screen here. And here we'll go. So first thing to do is to decipher the prompt. Then you will need to create a thesis statement and outline your paper. We are going to handle those things in that order. As you can see, deciphering the prompt, writing a thesis statement, brainstorming, and outlining. Feel free to skip ahead. The sections should be clearly labeled, but feel free to listen to the whole thing if you need it also. First things first, what are you being asked to write about? This is sometimes actually challenging, especially if you're not having time in class to ask questions, which is very typical of an online class. Basically, your first step is to decide whether you're being asked a narrative question or an analytical question, because this is very key to how you choose to approach the rest of your paper. A narrative paper just asks you to describe things, to kind of repeat passages from the textbook and prove that the events you're talking about actually happened. This is a more kind of antiquated way of assigning a history paper. It's usually an older professor or a professor who has a very traditional kind of outlook on papers. This kind of prompt, if your professor asks it of you, they're not asking you to make grand conclusions, they're just asking you to repeat information in a logical way. Analytical papers are actually the most common. Most professors these days want you to explain how or why something happened, or to debate a controversial question. This allows them to test not only can you repeat information, but have you been able to process the information and draw your own conclusions. So this is a much more common prompt. If you are given a history paper, your odds are very high that it is an analytical paper. But we'll talk about some ways here in a second to identify them. How do you know what kind of prompt you have? Narrative uses words like describe. So for example, describe the events leading up to the Civil War, or what was Woodrow Wilson's role in creating the League of Nations? These are straightforward prompts. If you have read your class material on the Civil War, you will be able to tell them what events in order. First it was this, then it was this, then it was this, with all of your citations from the textbook. What was Woodrow Wilson's role in creating the League of Nations? Again, if you've read your textbook and your other source materials, this is a straightforward assignment that you can just pull pieces from and you can describe what Woodrow Wilson did. The analytical take you one step further. These are how and why questions. How did the eugenics movement rise to prominence in the 20th century? Why did the Civil War happen? These require you not just to take information, right? The Civil War started in 1861 because of X, Y, and Z. It requires you to say the Civil War happened because something else, right? You're not just saying the events, you're saying why they're important and how they generated the war. You're not just saying what the eugenics movement was, but you're saying here are the societal factors that allowed it to rise. So these are very different things. They're not just talking about what happened, you're talking about why it matters. If your prompt doesn't use any of these words, you should look for equivalent phrases. In what way is pretty close to how, discuss the extent to which is pretty close to why. Sometimes professors don't use the plainest, most direct language, so you do have to kind of interpret, are they asking a how question? Are they asking a why question? If you're being asked, if you don't see how or why, you might be being asked to debate a controversial question. For example, has the civil rights movement achieved its goals? This is still analytical. This still requires you to go beyond the immediate, obvious, demographic information or historical information. But it's not necessarily asking you how or why something happened. What it is doing is asking you to take the information you have and extrapolate it. So it is still analytical. But honestly, if you're ever in doubt, ask your instructor or your TA what you are being asked to do. Speaking from personal experience, it's almost guaranteed that they would rather answer your question at the beginning of the project than have to deduct points at the end for something that they thought was self-explanatory, but might not have been to you. We write these prompts from our own perspective. We sometimes don't know without questions or feedback that those are not self-explanatory to our students. So do be careful to communicate with them rather than just accept a docking of your grade. So that's kind of my advice on that front. The writing process, at this point, you know how to write. By the time you've hit a college paper, you kind of know basically how to organize yourself, but there are some things about the writing process that can be really confusing, and I'm actually going to approach this kind of lecture series in the order in which I write my papers, so I do want to talk about that because it's not necessarily completely intuitive. For me, in my experience, sometimes order matters. It might be the case that writing from beginning to end doesn't work for you. It doesn't work for me. If I start at the introduction and try to write straight through to the conclusion, I will sit staring at the page for about 2 hours without writing anything. For me, I can't start at the beginning and work to the end. That might be the case for you. If you have a hard time starting your papers, this might be the method for you. I write my thesis statement first, then my body paragraphs, then my conclusion, then my introduction. I actually get to the first part of my paper last because by that point, I know everything I wanted to say, so it's very easy for me to lead in with it. If starting your intro is the hardest part for you, give my model a try. But seriously, if you have a way that works for you, keep doing it. Don't mess with success. At this point, I'm assuming that all of you have an idea of how you like to write. If there are parts of it that you still struggle with, maybe give some of these new orders and new strategies a try. My examples for the rest of this lecture series are going to be based on the following simplified hypothetical prompt. This is not one that I've assigned. This is just one that I created specifically because none of the classes I've been in have assigned it. It's very simplified. Your professors will probably have a lot more detail, but it gives us something to work on. Was the mass internment of Japanese Americans during World War II based on a real risk? If not, why did the US government seek and permit it? So every example I use from now on is going to relate to this prompt. And we're going to start with our thesis statement, because if you don't have a thesis statement, it's really hard to write the rest of it. You need to have an idea of exactly what you want to write and how you want to get there. I'll do a more detailed polishing your thesis statement lecture at another time, but for now, let's just accept that you need a thesis statement. There are a few small things you can do to make a thesis statement easier. Your first draft should just answer the writing prompt. That's it, just answer the prompt. Answer the question. I call this a working thesis because I don't ever want my working thesis to be the final product because my paper is going to change. As I work through it, I might discover different components of it, but you do need something to guide your thoughts. I completely am one of those people who gets lost on a tangent if I don't direct myself from the beginning. So it's designed to help me work, not to be a finished product. After you finish the body and the conclusion, go back and polish it. Make sure it matches what you actually wrote. The key to a good thesis is that you have to be concise and you have to directly connect it to the question. If it fulfills both requirements, it will be more successful than a wordy thesis statement or an off-topic one. Because both both of those factors, wordiness and off-topic, impede your reader's ability to understand the rest of your paper. If your thesis statement isn't like, boom, right to the point, then it's going to be a lot harder to get good credit on your paper because they won't understand what you're saying. And it's always better to feel like you're being too direct than not direct enough. When in doubt, go short and sweet. For an example, was the mass internment of Japanese Americans during World War II based on a real risk? If not, why did the US government seek and permit it? My working thesis, the internment of Japanese Americans was an inhumane measure based on racist war hysteria rather than on military necessity. See, that's a direct answer. That it was not necessary, it was not a risk, and it was based on racism and hysteria. There we go, direct question. That may not be in there in the final version of my paper, but it's in it right now and it will help me continue to write. Brainstorming and outlining are two things that I always insist on talking about with my students when I have the chance, because they really help get you off to the right start. If you don't take the time to organize your ideas at the beginning, you often find that you're having trouble organizing yourself later on. Brainstorming is really subjective, right? It depends on how your brain works, how do you like to organize things. And I like lists and I like mind maps. You may have a strategy that works better for you than either of these things. Use it. I find it's most helpful to write down both the components of my working thesis and the segments of the course materials that support those components. So effectively, each idea you write down should also have a matching passage from your sources. For example, and I will write in here right now, if I'm working with my thesis, right, no military necessity, right, source 1, page 2. Right, if I'm writing about official justification, military, source 2, page 1. These don't have to be in any particular order. The purpose of outlining is to organize it. The purpose of brainstorming is to just put it all on a page, right? So you get a few ideas out, match them with a source so that you can come back to it later. Outlining is something that takes a little bit of extra effort up front, but it saves you a lot of trouble down the road. When I do not outline, a paper takes me a lot longer to write, honestly. The 15 to 20 minutes I spent before I start writing, organizing my thoughts, saves me 2 hours because I'm not going off on tangents. I'm not kind of sitting there trying to decide, oh, what goes next? What order do I want this in? I'm not editing it 4 different times. I do my organizing on the front end. It makes the editing a lot easier on the back end. My system is very traditional. I do the kind of Roman numeral system, which I'll show you in a minute. But you should use any outline system that makes sense to you. Bullet points, arrows, lists, brain dumps, whatever works for you, but do organize it up front. I find this a useful strategy for myself because I have a ton of ideas and always have a hard time putting them in the right order. If this describes you, then this is definitely something you want to make time for. It does require you to make time. This is part of why we tell you, oh, don't write your papers the night before. If you write your paper the night before, you probably don't have time to outline effectively, and your paper is going to be disorganized. Just a pro tip. For example, right, I'm sitting here going, okay, first I want to talk about, first I need my intro and my working thesis. And I'm not going to type that in now, but I would typically write that in there. Then we have point 1, official justification. And then I'd kind of say my argument, what evidence do I plan to use, how does the evidence prove my argument. None of this has to be in complete sentences. I might say argument, military necessity. claimed the government. My evidence, I can just write down what I wrote in the brainstorm, right? Source 1, page 2. How does the evidence prove my argument? The government said that there was military danger post Pearl Harbor. That's all I have to say, right? This is not a complete, right, readout of everything I'm going to say, but it does get me started and help me organize myself. And the next thing I want to talk about is point 2, paranoia, and I continue that same thing, point 3, racism, and then my conclusion, right? This helps me organize everything, and I would use all of these things: argument, evidence, support, right? Just kind of go through it like that. Now when I sit down to write, I have all of that information right in front of me, and I can just fill in the blanks. That 20-30 minutes that I just spent doing that has just saved me a lot of staring at a page. So there are a couple final takeaways that we have. Just in summary, right? Your assignment is most likely to ask you to analyze something. Some professors may want you to narrate. If you're at all confused, ask your TA or your instructor. They would rather hear from you now than deduct points later. Second, make sure to write your paper in whatever order makes sense to you. But always, always, always start with your thesis statement to guide your ideas. It's easier to write if you know what you're arguing. And finally, brainstorming and outlining are little things that make a huge difference. You save yourself a lot of time and a lot of hassle in the editing process just by taking the time out at the beginning to organize yourself. All right. So returning kind of to the main screen here. Thank you for watching my video. I'm very new at this, so bear with me if there are any technical or sound quality issues, but I hope that this is useful for you as you're writing papers for your history classes remotely, especially if there's not a ton of time included in the syllabus for writing tutorials. Leave a comment, leave a like. I'll be adding to this, so if you'd like to subscribe and get more updates, go for it. As I said, I'm very new to the video recording and lecture scenario. Feedback is appreciated. Thanks for watching, guys.